Hi, it's Tim Constantine from the Washington Times and the Capitol Hill Show. My guest today is Dr. Sascha Sheehan, Associate Dean of the College of Public Affairs at the University of Baltimore, also a professor there of public and international affairs. You focus on terrorism, counterterrorism, and conflict management. Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Tim. Thanks for having me.
You know, I just got back from the region, and I'm always fascinated when you're in any part of the Middle East region. But I was in Baghdad, and a lot of the conversation had to do with their neighbors, Iran, and particularly because the United States and Iran are now tiptoeing, considering having discussions, indirect discussions at first, of course, but they're deciding what to do and whether or not to engage and what this means long term. How do you see Iran currently? What's their position? What's the current state of the nation?
Well, it's such an important question to ask, Jim. You know, from my perspective, the Iranian regime has never been weaker. The country is beset with soaring inflation. Unemployment is rampant. The rial, the currency, is in free fall. And there is deep discontent on the Iranian street. You know, the regime in Iran is near universally criticized, whether by Amnesty International or Human Rights Monitor, for anything from its support of terrorism to its egregious human rights abuses to its weaponization of the death penalty. And so I think there are deep concerns that the regime should have by the degree of scrutiny that they are receiving by the international community.
We saw for years their neighbors, Syria, offer their citizens a horrible life. They had many of the problems you just described, and yet Bashar Assad stayed and stayed and stayed until finally he didn't. And I guess that's the question here is there a vulnerability? Just because there is high inflation, just because there's high unemployment, just because there are human rights abuses doesn't necessarily mean a regime is on its way out. Are there vulnerabilities for the existing regime that put them maybe at a higher risk than some people realize?
Well, the cracks are wide and they're deep. I found myself explaining this on Capitol Hill just a few weeks ago. You know, the funny thing about dictatorships is that they always seem permanent until they're not. And just as the Syrian regime fell in just 11 days, so too will the Iranian regime fall. The question is not whether it will fall, the question is really when.
The next question then is what happens? When America pushed Saddam Hussein out in Iraq, the American mindset was, we'll just implement democracy here. And yet, if you have not had democracy, it doesn't just snap into place. It was a 20-year place from even in 2005, Iraq passed their constitution, but they still had corruption. They still had all kinds of economic problems. They had security issues. It's only now that they are really making big progress 20 years after that constitution. So the question sometimes is, all right, if you create a vacuum, who's there to fill it? And I guess that's the question. If something does happen to the regime in Iran, are there certain groups that are ready? The Shah's son, Reza, pops up every now and again. There are other groups. So who's available and who's realistic?
Well, you're putting your finger on a number of really important issues. If you step back from this particular question and you look at some of the indices that we're familiar with, and you look at something like economic freedom. I noticed last night that the Iranian regime in the latest Index of Economic Freedom, a ranking compiled by the Heritage Foundation, ranks in the bottom quartile among nations in the world. If you look at Transparency International's Index of Corruption, they feature an extraordinary level of corruption. If you look at Freedom House and you look at the degree of civil and political liberties, they feature year after year as highly repressed. The only badge of distinction, the only #1 ranking that they hold year to year is the State Department's listing of them as the leading state sponsor of terrorism. And so the question becomes, as you said, what do you do with such a state? Is there an alternative? And to answer that question, I think I would take a step back. And I may date myself a little bit here, Tim, but I began studying the Iranian regime almost a quarter century ago, 25 years ago. As a student in the 1990s, I began studying the problem of terrorism. This was a time when terrorism was considered little more than a second or even third tier issue. Nation-state conflict was the big issue of the day. A rising China, a resurgent Russia. And the big debate at the time was whether we had, as Francis Fukuyama had put it, reached the end of history, or whether, as Samuel Huntington had put it, there would be in the future this clash of civilizations. The problem of terrorism was understudied in the field of political science. But all of that changed on 9/11, when terrorism was thrust to the fore. And again, my twin interest in both terrorism and Iran became suddenly very, very important. I began to undertake some of the first evidence-based counterterrorism assessments in the United States during the so-called War on Terror. I created the largest terrorism incident database for the period from 1992 through 2004, and began to mine this quantitative data to look at the efficacy of US counterterrorism policy in this global war on terror. And what I found again and again was that boots on the ground, American military force, preemptive action actually worsened the problem of terrorism. It frequently increased the level and lethality and dispersion of transnational terrorist attacks. This became the foundation for my first book, When Terrorism and Counterterrorism Clash, The War on Terror and the Transformation of Terrorist Activity. And when I began to describe these findings to US officials, I was confronted with an important question, and that was, if boots on the ground, if preemptive action is insufficient to address the problem of terrorism, what are we to do with, for example, the leading state sponsor of terrorism in the modern world, the Iranian regime? And it was there that I began to examine a very well-constituted, well-organized Iranian opposition broadly construed. Following the 1979 revolution in Iran, this opposition, that is, people who joined the dissident community, frustrated by what they had seen in Iran, fanned out across the world and began to kind of create different opposition movements. And I began to study those various opposition movements to try to determine for myself whether or not they offered a credible alternative. And so what I found over time was that if you really want to understand contemporary Iranian affairs, you really want to understand the frustration, the discontent on the Iranian street, you really have to understand the alternative that they've been offered. That is, a ruling theocracy on the one hand that represses their freedoms and squanders their future, and then on the other hand, a dissident community that offers them hope, hope for the protection of human rights, hope for the protection of democracy, and hope for a brighter future, both in the region and around the world.
Now, when we talk about that community that has spread around the world, whether they're in Europe or in the United States or elsewhere, there are different groups. One is Reza, who is the son of the Shah, the infamous Shah of Iran. Is he a viable alternative to the current regime? If this regime falls, does it make any sense that he becomes the new leader of Iran?
I don't believe he is a credible alternative to the ruling theocracy. It's important here to take a step back as well and to acknowledge that the Pahlavi dynasty was marked by historic repression and terrible excesses. Remember that the 1979 revolution in Iran occurred because of those excesses and because of the Pahlavi dynasty's brutality. It was a clear rejection of monarchy. And so today, when you look at the protests on the Iranian street, what you see protesters chanting no to the Ayatollahs, but also no to monarchy. And so, no, I don't believe he's a credible alternative. Now, to be clear, what he is good at is he's good at social media. And if the elections in Iran were decided in Southern California, like a municipal election in Los Angeles, he might find support. But this is laughable, right? Candidates in Iran are selected by the Guardian Council and then ultimately decided by the supreme leader, not in Southern California.
Are there essential elements when you look at these different groups around, and if there were to be regime change, are there criteria that we could list out that would logically make sense and tell us what groups are credible and viable and what groups are not?
I think this is such an important question, Tim. You know, one way of unpacking the Iranian opposition broadly construed is to see some groups as being part of what I sometimes call the lawful opposition, and some groups as being part of what I would call the unlawful opposition. The lawful opposition reflects not regime change, but regime modification. This is change that the regime believes it can incorporate, or at least, not get thrown out. But those who are in that unlawful camp, they really reflect very profound, significant change with the ruling elites in Iran. From my perspective, yes, there are attributes that any Iranian opposition organization should have. First among them, they need to have an organization, right? It can't just be a small group of frustrated individuals. They need to have a clear organization with a hierarchy and ideally a command and control structure. Number two, they need to have a platform. Ideally, it's a platform that has been consistent over time. That is, they didn't just pull it out of the sky yesterday. And number three, they need to have both domestic and international support. A lot of these things are driven by competent leadership at the top of the organization.
There's a group called the MEK that has a long history there in Iran, going back into the Shah's era. Do they meet those criteria? They fall under the umbrella of the NCRI. Do they meet that criteria when you talk about they have an organized group, they have a history, they have a specific plan for how they'd like to achieve things? Do they fall into that viability index?
They absolutely do. I've had the honor of studying the MEK and the NCRI for, almost 2 decades now. And what's interesting from my perspective as a scholar, somebody who requires facts and evidence in order to make decisions, is that they've given me access, unfettered access, to their rank and file and to their leadership. They've opened their books, and I've met with their leadership in Washington and in Paris, France, and in Tirana, Albania. I've seen what they're all about. And this is unique among Iranian opposition organizations, because too often, Tim, what we find is that when we do discover an Iranian opposition organization, we can't figure out what their address is, or whether they hold actual conferences, or what it is that they're all about, because even their platforms change over time. And with the MEK and the NCRI, what we've got an organization that has been behind a 10-point plan since around 2006. And they've been unwavering in their commitment to democracy and human rights and gender equality and building an Iran that is at peace with her neighbors and at peace with Western powers.
You mentioned gender equality. The MEK is led, the NCRI is led by a woman, and much of the leadership throughout the entire organization is female, which is fascinating for Iran.
It is fascinating, and I think this helps to speak to why they receive so much attention from the regime. The Iranian regime is fiercely misogynistic. When you look at a study that was undertaken by one of my colleagues, the late political scientist, Professor Raymond Tanter at the Iran Policy Committee, he and his students found that the Iranian regime pays 350% more attention to the MEK and the NCRI than all other opposition organizations combined. In no small part, Tim, is this driven by the fact that the NCRI is led by a woman, Madam Mariam Rajavi, and she stands as a real alternative to the male misogynistic regime in Iran.
The regime is very critical of her group, but the Shah's son is very critical as well. He says, of course, that he's not aligned with the current regime, and yet much of the criticism he has of the MEK is straight out of the regime playbook. So are they just taking that because it's convenient? Is there any alignment there? What should we learn from that?
Well, that's important, and I think we need to understand a bit more why it is that he's saying what he is saying. You know, Tim, I had the pleasure back in 2011, 2012, to be introduced to a senior U.S. statesman, Ambassador Lincoln Bloomfield. And he had prepared a manuscript that amounted to a history of the MEK. It was an incredibly sophisticated kind of manuscript at the time, and I provided some feedback on it. And he ultimately asked me to prepare the foreword for that book. But what was so interesting was that after publication in 2012, we began to meet with senior U.S. officials. And I recall one particular meeting that we had at a prominent think tank in Washington, where we had a sit down with some of the senior analysts and senior fellows at the think tank. And there was one senior former U.S. official in attendance. And I'll try not to say too much so that he doesn't become identifiable. But what we encountered in that particular discussion was emotional and value-laden and subjective. And it seemed to be, as you were just suggesting, the regime's talking points. I walked away a bit unsettled from that discussion, thinking either this senior U.S. official is compromised and on the take, or he is the victim of an influence operation and doesn't understand what it is that he doesn't understand. But when we hear talking points that sound as if they were prepared themselves by the Ministry of Intelligence and Security in Iran, they likely were. And it's important that we ask whether these individuals that are saying these things are in fact puppets of the regime, or whether or not they're providing their own objective assessments.
I read your book, The Ayatollah's Hidden Hand, and as you finish, you come to some conclusions. You boil it down. There's some great information in there, and anybody that's interested in the region should read it. But I guess my question is, the Iranian people who are still living there on the ground, do they want change? And if we think the answer is yes, what evidence is there of that?
Well, I just met recently with a former student of mine who had just returned from Iran, having served under non-official cover inside Iran. And one of the things he told me was that he couldn't get in or out of a taxi cab in Tehran without hearing a deep frustration with the ruling elite, the mullahs in Iran. We know as well as academics in the United States that we encounter every year waves of students that are seeking to leave Iran to study in the United States or study in Europe because they feel like they have no future inside the country. And we know as well, Tim, that there are generations of women who feel as if their futures have been squandered and they've been subjugated. So do the people of Iran want change? They absolutely do. And I think you need only see that in the dozens and dozens and dozens of protests that occur on an annual basis, and the, depending on how you count them, 4 to 6 countrywide uprisings that have lasted anywhere from months to years that have unfolded across the Iranian landscape since 2018.
You mentioned the demonstrations, and those are sometimes met with brutal force, with deadly force. And there's a long history with this regime of the use of deadly force, which some perceive as a sign of strength. You do not. Explain.
It's a sign of weakness. It's a sign that the Iranian regime is on its heels. They lash out when they feel like they have no other options, but they also lash out when they feel that the world is engaging them and they can use the dissident community or the protesters on the Iranian street as bargaining chips. That's where it's so important, Tim, that we convince both US officials but also parliamentarians around the world that there is an alternative and that they need not engage with a regime that is engaging in this degree of hostility towards its own people.
Some people have been waiting decades for change, for regime change. And whenever I meet with people from the region, they are hopeful that that change is coming, that it's close, that it's just around the corner. You've studied this closer than most. You know the situation more than most. How likely is change in the near future?
Well, Tim, I'm an optimistic person by nature. And so what I would say is what I often say to my students, which is, I believe, as Dr. King said, that the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice. I do believe that the voices on the Iranian street will ultimately bring regime change and freedom will come to Iran. But in the near term, there are hurdles to overcome. The regime will not reform by itself. It will not reform from within. And if the United States continues to traffic in appeasement, then there won't be the sufficient degree of pressure that the regime needs put on it. Nor will protesters on the Iranian street feel safe to take to the streets to make their voices heard.
Dr. Sheehan, thanks very much.
It's been a pleasure, Tim. Thank you.